The official title was given to me as Is Biblical Creation Intellectually Sustainable? I personally prefer From the Goo to You by Way of the Zoo as a title for a discussion of creation and evolution, because that's essentially what evolution is proposing. First, I want to stress a fact, and that there is actually a method behind this. Some of my credentials: I have a bachelor's from Cornell, a master's in chemistry, a PhD in chemistry from Florida State. I did postdoc work at Los Alamos National Laboratory, worked for Abbott Laboratories. I've taught general chemistry, organic chemistry, biochemistry, and biostatistics at the college level. I had 7 publications in peer-reviewed journals, 2 chapters in biotechnology books, and 2 patents. So all that is nothing compared to my relationship with Christ. I am not a Christian scientist. I'm a Christian who is a scientist. So just to make that distinction. But why did I just go through all that? Very simply because a lot of evolutionists try to frame the conversation immediately by saying you can't be a scientist if you don't believe in evolution. The enemy tries to define terms in ways that basically shuts down discussions immediately. You're not a scientist, so you have no reason to talk because you don't believe in evolution. You may have heard, all real scientists believe in evolution. You can't be a biologist and not believe in evolution. Well, we've got a whole faculty here that have credentials, many of which are more impressive than mine, that in fact don't believe in evolution, and they are scientists still. Don't let the enemy usurp the vocabulary. That is one of the strategies that you find in many arenas, where someone will try to define something in a way that it's not normally used, but will redefine it and then use that against you. Recognize what's going on and reject that, and don't let them tell you that you're not a scientist if you don't believe in evolution. So, what is the biggest stone that is usually thrown at creationists by evolutionists? This is a question now for audience participation. What do you think is one of the biggest stones that gets thrown at creationists whenever you enter in a discussion with evolutionists about why they think you're wrong? Yes, ma'am.
You don't really have proof.
Don't have proof. That's
The Bible's not really real proof to them.
right. Right. Yeah. That's probably one way to arrive at or to go at that. But what's the flip side of that? Yes, sir.
Evolution is a fact that's
And it's a fact because,
decided on by the scientific community.
and it's a fact because we don't have proof, but
They have proof.
they have proof in this alleged mountain of evidence, all the evidence, and then they'll start throwing things at you left and right, and you can't even, before you can respond to even one of them, they're moving on to the next thing and saying, see, this proves it, and this proves it, and this proves it, and this proves it. And they also usually throw in a healthy dose of ridicule and try to portray creationists as knuckle-dragging troglodytes. No, those guys just don't know anything. So, what to do? Well, I obviously don't have the time or even the expertise in some cases to evaluate all the alleged evidence. But I have found, as I went through my career, I started off, before I became a Christian, I became a Christian between my junior and senior years in high school. And in high school, I was in the college prep biology where they taught us evolution, and so I believed evolution because that's what it was told me. And then I became a Christian, and so my immediate said, oh, that must mean I'm now a theistic evolutionist because God must have used evolution to do his creation. Well, that basically puts you in the crosshairs of everybody, because the evolutionists don't like you because you're acknowledging God, and the creationists don't like you because you're acknowledging evolution. And really, the whole issue does have a problem with evolution, as I will try to show you. As I was trained at Cornell in biology, I started to see that I could lump or I could categorize this giant mountain of evidence for evolution, supposedly. I could start to categorize all the evidence into one of three categories. And that's what the main thing I want to share with you today. The first category I call unnatural selection. And maybe about 10% of the data falls into this. And these aren't precise. I'm going to give you some numbers, but these aren't precise. This is just my estimate. Maybe about 10% of the data falls into what is, I would call, unnatural selection. And this is where the scientist will look at and only present that part of the data that fits his model. So, anybody have an idea what might be the classic example for that? Yes, ma'am, on the back.
Scientists often use the fossil record in canyons and such, but then they polystrate fossils.
Yes, the fossil record is the classic example of only showing what agrees with evolution and totally ignoring any counter evidence. And one book this is somewhat old now, Dwayne Gish has written a book, Evolution, the Fossils Say No. I think he's got an updated version that's entitled Evolution, the Fossils Still Say No. I'll be showing a third book that actually is another excellent source. But one of the big problems with the fossil record is the absence or the problem of so-called transitional forms, because evolution assumes that you're going to make small steps along the way and there should be these transitional forms. Well, most of you are familiar with, or probably are familiar with Archaeopteryx, the alleged transition between dinosaurs and birds. But how many of you recognize that bird? It's called the Hoatzin. I think it's this one is in South America, but the baby Hoatzins have claws on their hands, and there's a number of structural features in the skeleton that are supposedly reptilian. And they're basically the same kinds of structures that you find in Archaeopteryx that also are supposedly reptilian that make it a transitional form. But you don't hear this bird being called a transitional form. It's called a bird because it has the audacity to still be running around on this planet. And it's not just that bird. There's a Turacos bird, which I believe this one is over in Africa. You can compare these to the artist renditions of Archaeopteryx, and there's actually some fair similarities. And this particular bird also shares some of those same reptilian features, supposedly, in the skeletal structure that would classify it, if it were just a fossil, as a transitional form. But again, it has the audacity to be running around on the planet these days, and so it's not considered a fossil form. So there's a problem with the transitional forms. Okay, how many of you have ever seen trees like this that supposedly relate to different dinosaurs? Yeah. This is what you typically see, and it's presented with great confidence. This one actually is unusually honest because down here it says, tinted areas indicate solid fossil evidence. In other words, we don't have tint, this is black, but in other words, that's where the real data is. The only real data there is in the lines that are black. Well, what happens if you remove all the lines? Oops, now it looks like a creation model with individual lines just appearing in the fossil record, poof, with no transitional forms. See, all those links are hypothetical. They're based on assumptions. So, do you think evolutionists simply don't know or aren't aware of these gaps? What do you think? Are they really being dishonest? Yes, sir.
I think that a lot of evolutionists lie to themselves so much that they almost believe their own lie. Because they don't want to accept the fact that there's a lie.
Yes, yes. And as one of the conclusions that I've drawn is a lot of cases they don't want to. It's a matter of the will. It's not a matter of the evidence. It's not a matter of creation being intellectually indefensible. It's they don't want to believe in a God to whom they might have to be accountable. In science, Dr. Woodruff once said, but fossil species remain unchanged throughout most of their history, and the record fails to contain a single example of a significant transition. He's not a creationist. He's not writing in a creationist magazine. Stephen Jay Gould is a famous anti-creationist evolutionist. He points out, we have long known about stasis and abrupt appearance, but have chosen to fob it off upon an imperfect fossil record. And Niles Eldredge, another famous evolutionist. Most families, orders, classes, and phyla appear rather suddenly in the fossil record, often without anatomically intermediate forms, smoothly interlinking evolutionary derived descendant taxa with their presumed ancestors. So actually, if they're honest, when they're honest, they make statements that make it clear that they're aware that there are problems with the data. The second category is the category I call faulty logic. About 10% of the data, again, I would put into this category. And this is errors in logical reasoning that would be obvious in the absence of bias. The classic example of this is, in fact, the abiotic biochemical origins of life. Where did life start from? And this is the goo part of from the goo to you by way of the zoo. Anybody here ever hear of the Stanley Miller experiment? Okay, we have one in the back. What Stanley Miller did was he assumed a certain primordial atmosphere had a certain composition. And he put that into a big flask, and then he threw some electricity through it to imitate lightning. And found, lo and behold, when he looked at the tar at the bottom of the flask at the end of a period of time, he had some basic building blocks of life. Aha! That must be how it happened, right? Well, not quite. Because what he didn't do is actually prove that the original primordial atmosphere had that composition. He didn't prove his initial assumption. And when you actually look at the components that he did make, he made a few building blocks, but he never made molecules, and he didn't make all the necessary components that they would have to in order to start life. Just because you have a few building blocks doesn't mean the Empire State Building is inevitable. There's a lot more to the Empire State Building than bricks. So what is it about the scientific method that makes scientists resort to faulty logic? This is audience participation time now again. What do you think is it about the scientific method? Think about what scientists are actually supposed to be doing. Yes, ma'am.
Well, when they ask questions, they ask it through a particular worldview. So they'll only ask the questions that they think will get them the answers that they want, perhaps.
Yeah, they are looking at the questions through a certain worldview. But what about the scientific method itself? What about the scientific method would drive them to actually have to look through their lenses a little bit differently than someone else? The scientific method is limited to what we can observe now, today. How many of us were here whenever this alleged goo was forming the zoo to make you? Not too many of us were around then, and they realized that as well. But so they have to resort to faulty logic, to going through a different worldview, because you can't directly observe this phenomenon because we weren't there. There's that, unless you've got Doctor Who's time machine and can go back to the beginning, in which case that's a different story. Okay, the third category. This is actually where I lump most of the data that's supposed to support evolution. It's the common data point category. So whenever you have two competing models, what you want to do is go to a place like out here or here where the models actually predict different outcomes. You don't want to go here and say, aha, my model predicts this, therefore my model must be true. Because if you're doing that and the other model, competing model, predicts the exact same thing, you're not going to be able to distinguish between the two. And this, I think, really is where you encounter most of the supposed data that supports evolution actually could be fit into a creationist model. But the evolutionists, number one, they don't understand the creationist model. They don't want to understand the creationist model. And so they only fit into the evolutionary model and say, aha, this proves evolution. So this observations or data that can be explained by either competing model or hypothesis, and they are therefore, they're really irrelevant to deciding between the two. And as I've already mentioned, it's usually they don't bother to even understand the creationist model in the first place. They just say, oh, the creationist model, they just believe God created everything, poof, wave of the hand, it's all magic, and therefore we're going to ignore it because it's not really scientific. And they don't that's not what the creationist model says. The classic example are similarities in amino acid sequences. Proteins are made up of amino acids, and you find often throughout the different species the same proteins with slightly different sequences. But by comparing those sequences, supposedly you can have what is called sequence homology, which allows the evolutionists allegedly to figure out how related these species are to one another. Now, a creationist model will look at this same phenomenon and say, well, why couldn't an intelligent creator just use the same motif to accomplish the same goals in different species? On that basis, you would actually predict commonalities with some minor differences, but still you get the same function. The only assumption that's necessary is, in fact, the existence of the God of the Bible to accomplish that. And just as an aside, the whole area of apologetics, in all the different various forms of apologetics, I would propose that the existence of the God of the Bible is actually not an assumption, but a conclusion based on data, based on evidence and logic. Homology, in order to do the same thing for the evolutionist has to make certain naturalistic assumptions. They have to assume that similarities in anatomy point to a common ancestor, that similarities in sequences point to a common ancestor. There's no proof for that. They have to assume it at the start. They have to assume that the degree of difference is proportional to the time elapsed since divergence from the common ancestor. So the more different the proteins are, the farther apart in time they are. They actually hold that molecular evidence they're looking at trumps the fossil evidence in terms of the relatedness that supposedly they see in the structure and the fossil timing. And they have to assume that different lineages evolve at the same rate. And basically all of these are assuming the truth of the theory of evolution at the start, and that's called begging the question, because that's the theory you're trying to prove with this. When you beg the question, you assume what you're trying to prove to be true automatically at the very beginning, a priori, before any consideration, and move from there. So that is a logical fallacy. Now, just to show you how absurd this can get, ran across this a couple summers ago that I just had to share with you because I have this warped sense of humor, as some of my students will tell you. This is actually an opinion article in Trends in Genetics. Last time I looked, the University of Houston and the Heinrich Heine Universität Düsseldorf were not hotbeds of creationist science. So these guys are not creationists, but they have entitled their critique of homology and using homology to create molecular clocks to try to relate different species to one another. They call it reading the entrails of chickens. And just in the postscript, they mention this in what will surely not be the last chapter in the story. A recent review in Trends in Genetics contains 4 blood-curdling innovations. Now, how scientific does that sound? Involving statistical methodology, taxonomy, physics of time reversal, and logic. And this is what I wanted to, physics, I'm a Doctor Who fan, so time reversal sort of interests me. Third novelty concerns the claim that 2 of these fungi diverged from one another before their common ancestor diverged from another species. So in other words, this claim requires time to run backwards for about 37 million years. Okay, so whose theory, seriously, is the one that's intellectually indefensible? This has all been sort of negative whenever you look at data that doesn't fit the evolutionary model. Evolutionists typically ignore data that actually fits creation better than evolution. And you may have heard of intelligent design, this whole line of evidence that says that there are certain things that look like they were designed. They're so perfectly matched to their function. And just for one, what is the information content? You've probably heard of the genetic code, where DNA codes for specific amino acids. Where did that information come from? Who told these this particular sequence that it's supposed to code for this amino acid and this amino acid only. Where did that information content come from? And there's actually been a fair amount of work done by creationists looking at information theory relative to biological phenomena. Where did the information that is present in so many biological phenomena come from? That's intelligent design. And then there's the concept of irreducible complexity. Obviously, we could spend a whole lot more time on this, but we're limited by time. But irreducible complexity, there's a lot of systems in biology where you have a lot of interacting parts, where if you remove just one of those parts, the whole thing falls apart and has no longer functions the way it's supposed to function. Well, how did that evolve in small transitional steps if, in fact, you have to have all of them in place to get anything working in the first place? So, references that I would recommend for reading: Darwin on Trial by Philip E. Johnson. I like this book because he's not a scientist, actually. He's a lawyer. And what he does is go after the philosophy behind evolution. And he sidesteps all the different arguments about the alleged evidence for evolution by looking at the underlying philosophy involved and how it's applied and the logic to their arguments and things like that. And he basically shows you how there's some significant problems there. The other one that I highly recommend, Darwin's Doubt. This gets to the fossil record in a lot of more detail than we can do here. There's this thing called the Cambrian explosion, where before the alleged Cambrian period, the fossil record is very sparse, very simple creatures, and then suddenly in the Cambrian period, you've got this explosion of multiple life forms that are very much more complex, and there's no intermediates in between. And it's a problem. And this book digests that and takes it apart and presents it in minute detail. It's actually very good. It's very easy reading. You don't have to be a scientist to read it. So why do evolutionists cling so desperately to evolution? Well, you may have heard of Richard Dawkins, adamant anti-Christian evolutionist. It is as though they, the fossils that is, were just planted there without any evolutionary history. Both schools of thought, which these are two punctuationalists and gradualists, so those are two evolutionary camps, despise so-called scientific creationists equally. Notice the emotional aspect, the subjective emotional content there. And both agree that the major gaps are real, so they're looking at the same evidence and seeing the same data, and that there are true imperfections in the fossil record. The only alternative of the sudden appearance of so many complex animal forms in the Cambrian era is divine creation. And we both reject this alternative. Why did they reject it? Because they don't want to accept it. Harold Urey is another evolutionist. All of us who study the origin of life find that the more we look into it, the more we feel that it is too complex to have evolved anywhere. We believe, as an article of faith, that life evolved from dead matter on this planet. It is just that its complexity is so great, it is hard for us to imagine that it did. Another evolutionist admitting that there's a problem. One last quote. Sorry, it's a little bit long. But if you just look at the red origin of life appears at this moment to be almost a miracle. The plain fact is that the time available is too long, too many microenvironments, too diverse, various chemical possibilities too numerous, our own knowledge and imagination too feeble, especially as we have no experimental evidence from that era to check our ideas against. This is Francis Crick, one of the guys who discovered the DNA molecule structure, who himself is such an evolutionist that he after going through this, he's proposed the theory that they've labeled panspermia, because hopefully if you give it a fancy name, that makes it sound more official. But panspermia is simply the idea that there's no evidence for life evolving on this planet. It must have come from another planet. And we don't know how it got here, but it got here. Maybe UFOs planted it here. So, biblical creation, I would conclude, is in fact intellectually defensible based on the theological nature of the evolution's position. You have to have more faith to believe in evolution, really, than in a creator God. Based on an evaluation of the actual data, and based on the objective problems fitting the alleged evidence for evolution into an evolutionary model. For additional resources, Ken Ham's Answers in Genesis is a very nice place to go for understandable material. There's my email. I will also forward you to Dr. David Boyd because he teaches our creation evolution course on campus here. He's my office next to me, and so I can pass any questions I don't know the answer to, I'll pass them to him.